I've always been fascinated by the way technology evolves. We think of technology evolving in a sort of an incremental way, but actually it tends to evolve in steps. If you think about air travel, before the 1900s, the only things that flew had feathers. By the 1920s, we had piston aircraft, and by the 1960s, we had jet travel across the Atlantic. And really, jet travel hasn't changed since the 1960s. Fundamentally, it's exactly the same. But the way technology reaches out varies greatly across the world. I was recently in Nairobi. And in Nairobi, you can walk around, you get 3G on your mobile phone, you can go onto the internet. I bought a book on Amazon, I watched a video, no problem. But 50 miles outside of the city, and the world looks very different. Here there is no water, there is no sanitation, there is no electricity. So imagine in this room if we had no electricity. You'd have no light, you'd have no mobile phones, we'd have no computers, we'd have no internet. The world as we know it would look very different indeed. But for 600 million people in Africa, that's twice the population of the United States. That's exactly the reality today. Instead, individuals have to find other ways of doing things. I'd like you to meet Florence. Florence is a young mother of 3 in South Sudan. And every day, she goes and spends 2 hours walking to go and cut grass. Because grass is the only thing she has for light in her house. And when in the middle of the night one of her children is crying, the first thing she has to do is to get some of that grass, put it into a hearth in the middle of her house and light it, and that will give her 10 minutes of light. Florence is suffering because she doesn't have access to electricity. And the number of people who don't have access to electricity in Africa is actually growing because the rate of population growth is currently greater than the rate of electrification. Many people use kerosene lamps as a means of lighting houses. And if you look at that kerosene lamp, it really wouldn't have looked out of place in the time of the pharaohs. Fundamentally, the technology hasn't changed. Kerosene lamps are dangerous, they're smelly, they provide a very poor amount of light, but most importantly, they're really very expensive. The equivalent cost of that light is about 40 times the cost of the light in this room. When somebody goes and gets their mobile phone charged in Africa and spends 20 cents to get their phone charged, which is a typical fee, that individual is spending 100 times the amount on their energy that we would pay if we plugged into the wall here. So the poorest in Africa are not just spending a little bit more for their energy, they're spending disproportionately more for their energy. And that's a problem that we need to go fix. And it's very easy to think of this in stereotypical terms. So we have poor, impoverished families in subsistence living. But actually, if you just think of it that way, that hides a much more vibrant and positive reality. Something like 40% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is under the age of 14. And those kids love their mobile phones. About 75% of individuals between the age of 16 and 25 have a mobile phone in Africa. So what we need to do is to find ways to harness that energy. And in fact, people are doing that. If you go to Kenya, you'll find that roughly half the population have mobile payment apps on their phones. People are using mobile payment in place of cash. They're using it in places of banks, way ahead of any type of e-cash or e-banking that we have in any Western country. So the lack of infrastructure is driving necessity to make people be early adopters within the African subcontinent. We know that solar power can provide energy for people who don't have access to mains. But solar power, like all renewables, has one big problem. When you pay for electricity or water or any other utility, you pay for it as you use it. But renewables in general, you pay for it all up front. And the equivalent cost of a small solar home system that costs about $70, something similar, is the equivalent of a second-hand car to somebody who's living in a rural environment in Africa. So what can we do about this? Well, if you look at that photo, one of the things that you'll see is there's a mobile phone tower in the background. And so a number of people started thinking, would it be possible to use technology to go and solve this problem? We pay for our phones on a pay-as-you-go basis. How about you can pay for your solar energy on a pay-as-you-go basis? In other words, can we use technology to turn a development problem into a business problem? Can we arc the gap between those rather nasty kerosene lamps that we saw and the very latest LED lighting technology? And that's something that's been done. So a small solar home system is put into somebody's house, essentially free of charge. And then the individual buys a scratch card once a week. And we use the mobile phone network to validate that scratch card. And the user gets a passcode on their phone, which they type into the unit. And the system then works for a week. And at the end of the week, they buy another scratch card and repeat the process. And after 18 months, the user then owns that system and they no longer have to pay for their energy. But the neat thing is that the cost of solar power has come down so much in the last few years that the cost of that scratch card is about half the cost of the kerosene and the mobile phone charging it replaces. So not only are people getting the latest technology, they're also halving their spend on energy. A basic system will provide lighting for 2 rooms for about 9 hours a night, and it provides a USB port that you'll all be familiar with for charging your mobile phone. So one of the questions we had to ask when we were putting this in place was, well, is this going to work? Will people get it? Will they understand this sort of technology? Or maybe actually it'll go the other way around. People understand it too well and they'll try and break into it. And so we ended up working extremely closely with the local communities, not only for the selling the products, but also supporting them, maintaining them, and making sure that there was an income stream coming into the local community from the management of those systems. And we got universities to go out and do studies to go and check whether this was working or not. And what they found was actually people have no difficulty at all working this equipment. They're perfectly familiar with having mobile phones that they pay for through pay-as-you-go, and therefore this sort of thing works just fine. And what we also found was that the community effect meant that people really valued the energy that they had in their house. And in fact, very, very few people stopped using it. After all, why would you? Because if you stop using it, you end up having to pay twice as much again for the kerosene that you had in the first place. I was recently in Sierra Leone. 10 years ago, Sierra Leone was in the middle of a brutal civil war. Today, Sierra Leone is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa. And what we found were all sorts of creative ways in which people were using energy. Fishermen take those solar lights and they haul them up their mast, and they use it so that they can fish at night time. Stall holders put the lights into their stalls so they can then sell goods during the night time. And children, on average, spend between 1 and 2 hours extra per day on study. And we got many, many stories of children whose grades have improved dramatically as a result of having solar light. Many of the places that don't have access to electricity are very remote. This is an example in Rwanda. It's another country which not so very long ago was in a civil war. And many of the households where the power is being put in are perhaps 15, 20 miles from the nearest road. They're farming communities, and individuals are using the fact that they have light in the evening in order to improve their income, because they're able to do crop preparation, other activities in the evenings. What we also find is that people no longer have to go and travel to charge their mobile phones. And actually, you'd be amazed, people spend typically between half a day and 1 day a week just going out getting their mobile phone charged. You've got to go to the town, you've got to get it charged, you've got to get it back, and so on. You've got to do that on a repeating basis. So that's an extra half to 1 day of productivity that everybody has. And in addition, we find that people, because they've got light in the evenings, they form groups, they talk to each other. They get to figure out what the market prices are for crops. They talk about problems that they've got with diseases and so on. So we found a way of getting power at scale to individuals in rural Africa. But what's next? Should we just wait for the grid, or can we do something different? I actually believe that there's a basic problem, and actually it comes back to words. The very phrase off-grid is really not very helpful. It's not the grid that individuals want. Individuals want access to the benefits of energy. So can we find ways of providing people the benefits to energy long before the grid arrives? For example, can we start off where people get a small solar home system, which gives them 2 lights and a phone? And then, almost like a sort of energy escalator, people can then progressively improve what they have to get themselves lights, a radio, a torch, a DVD, access to the internet, access to television, using the very latest technology we can find to provide products at a price point which are affordable for those individuals. It's going to be a long time before the grid gets to many of these rural areas. The average population density in rural Africa is about 5 households per square kilometre. At the moment, individuals are spending about $2 to $5 a week on energy. There's no reason to assume, if they had the grid, that they would magically have more money to spend on energy. So it's going to be a very long time before the grid becomes economic. But instead, by using this latest technology, we can find ways of giving individuals access to modern communications, modern entertainment, modern lighting, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is about aspiration. Here are a couple of kids in Uganda, and it's an interesting photo I took a couple of years ago. And as you can see, the kids have got mobile phones. But look more closely. Those children don't have mobile phones. What they've got is mud mobile phones. What we've got to do is to find a way of harnessing this creativity. Can we use access to these sorts of devices to enable communities to step over the Industrial Revolution and instead take one step ahead towards the knowledge economy? Thank you.